Jack Dalton had learned to appreciate the ordinary moments of life. After years of dangerous missions overseas as a Navy SEAL, he now found peace in the simple routines of suburban living. His home sat on a quiet street lined with trimmed hedges, manicured lawns, and the faint glow of porch lights. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the chirping of crickets filled the evening with a calming rhythm. Jack sat on the back porch, sipping a glass of water, while his wife Claire arranged potted plants near the steps. Claire enjoyed tending to her flowers in the evenings, often talking to them as if they were friends. Jack would tease her gently about it, but in truth, he loved seeing her so happy. The couple had moved into this neighborhood only a year ago, eager to settle into a life free of constant deployments and uncertainty. For the most part, they found comfort in the stability of their surroundings. The homeowners association sometimes felt overly strict, but Jack considered it a small price to pay for order and safety. That evening, the soft hum of a car approaching broke the stillness. Claire looked up as headlights swept across their driveway. A black SUV rolled to a stop, its engine idling low. 3 men stepped out, each wearing dark uniforms that looked official at first glance. On their chests gleamed metallic badges, though the design seemed unusual. One of the men carried a clipboard, and the others stood with the stiff posture of people trying to look authoritative. "Good evening, ma'am," the man with the clipboard said as he approached. His voice carried a firm tone. "We're with the Homeowners Association Security Detail. We need to conduct a quick inspection regarding compliance issues." Claire frowned. "This late in the evening, I wasn't aware of any scheduled inspection." "It's a routine check," the man replied quickly. "There have been several violations reported in the area, and we're making sure residents are following guidelines." Jack, still on the porch, stayed seated but listened carefully. His instincts tingled. He had seen enough fake authority figures during his years in service to recognize when someone was overcompensating. These men carried themselves like enforcers rather than neighborhood staff. Still, he remained quiet, allowing Claire to handle the exchange for the moment. The man glanced at Claire's flower pots. "These aren't within regulation distance from the steps. They need to be moved immediately." Claire's eyes narrowed. "That's not true. I checked the guidelines myself when I placed them. They're perfectly fine where they are." The man's jaw tightened. "Are you questioning our authority?" Claire crossed her arms. "I'm simply asking for clarification. If there's an issue, I'd prefer to see it in writing." The 2 men standing behind him shifted slightly, as though waiting for an order. Their silence was heavier than the night air, and their stares were unsettling. Jack noted the unmarked SUV, the absence of identification on their uniforms, and the way they were trying to intimidate rather than inform. His grip on the glass in his hand tightened, but he resisted the urge to stand. For now, he wanted to see how far they would push. One of the men stepped closer, his voice lower but sharper. "You don't want to make this difficult, ma'am. We can issue fines or worse." Claire felt her heartbeat quicken, but she steadied her voice. "If you're truly with the association, then you'll provide proper notice. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." The response seemed to strike a nerve. The man with the clipboard suddenly lashed out, striking Claire across the cheek with the back of his hand. The sound of the impact cut through the quiet night like a crack of thunder. Claire stumbled back, her hand flying to her face in shock. Jack was on his feet instantly, his eyes cold and focused. The men had crossed a line. He took a step forward but forced himself to stop. His training screamed at him to react, but years of discipline urged patience. This was not the moment. The imposters wanted control through fear, and showing immediate retaliation would escalate too quickly. Claire's eyes welled, but she stood tall, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "You'll regret that," she whispered, her voice trembling yet defiant. The imposters sneered, muttered a warning about further checks, and retreated toward their SUV. The vehicle pulled away into the night, leaving behind the faint smell of exhaust and a heavy silence. Jack reached Claire and gently touched her shoulder. The mark on her face was already turning red, but what struck him more was the fire in her eyes. She was hurt, yes, but also angry. "They weren't real security," Jack said quietly, his voice steady, "and they just made the biggest mistake of their lives." Claire leaned into him, drawing strength from his calm presence. The peaceful evening was gone, replaced by a storm that neither of them had expected. But Jack Dalton had faced storms before, and this one would not break him. The night air felt heavier after the strangers left. Claire sat on the couch with a cool cloth pressed to her cheek, her hand trembling despite her best effort to remain calm. The sting of the slap still burned, but what troubled her more was the way the men had carried themselves. They hadn't behaved like neighbors or association staff. They had moved with the confidence of people used to intimidating others. Jack sat beside her, his gaze steady and unreadable. Years of discipline kept his emotions in check, but Claire knew him well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind his eyes. He had seen countless forms of aggression during his military career, but to see his wife struck in their own yard, it awakened a different kind of anger. "They weren't who they claimed to be," Claire whispered, breaking the silence. Jack nodded slowly. "No, real association staff would never act like that. They didn't even ask you to sign anything, and their badges weren't authentic." Claire pressed the cloth harder against her cheek. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Yes," Jack said without hesitation. "Men like that don't just walk away. They'll return when they think we're vulnerable." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "Then what do we do?" Jack leaned back, his mind already working through possibilities. Every detail mattered, the vehicle they drove, the way they communicated, even the strike delivered against Claire. It wasn't random. It was meant to scare her, to establish control. That meant they had a larger goal in mind, and Jack needed to find out what it was. While Claire rested, Jack stepped outside to retrace the moment. The faint tire marks from the SUV were still visible on the pavement. He crouched low, studying the direction they had come from and the way they had positioned their vehicle. It had been deliberate. They parked in a way that allowed a fast exit, which meant they were experienced at confrontation. He scanned the street. Several neighbors had seen what happened, yet none had intervened. Curtains had been pulled back, shadows had moved behind windows, but when the imposters left, those same curtains had quickly closed again. Jack understood their fear, but it frustrated him. People shouldn't feel powerless in their own community. Back inside, Claire sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "They looked at me like I was just an obstacle," she said quietly. "Not a person, an obstacle in the way of something they wanted." Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's exactly what they thought, but they don't know who they're dealing with." The next morning, Claire insisted on reporting the incident to the Homeowners Association office. She wanted to know if the organization had truly sent anyone. Jack accompanied her, his silent presence a steady comfort. The office manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, seemed genuinely shocked when Claire described the uniforms, the SUV, and the slap. "We don't have a security detail that operates that way," the manager said firmly. "And certainly not at night. If anyone from our staff behaved like that, they'd be fired immediately." Jack studied her expression, searching for any hint of deception. He found none. She was disturbed by the story, not defensive. That confirmed his suspicion. These men weren't connected to the official association at all. They were imposters using the name as a shield. When they left the office, Claire took a deep breath. "So it's worse than I thought. They weren't even connected to the association." Jack nodded. "Which means their reason for being here has nothing to do with rules about flower pots or property lines. They're after something else." The realization unsettled Claire. Their quiet neighborhood had felt safe until now, but the memory of the men's cold stares lingered. Every parked car seemed suspicious, every stranger walking past seemed to carry hidden intent. That evening, Claire tried to distract herself by returning to her plants, but her hands shook as she moved the pots. Jack watched her from the porch. He knew she was trying to reclaim her sense of normalcy, but the truth was, normal had already been stolen. As twilight fell, Jack made a silent vow. If the imposters returned, he would not stand by again. He had given them the chance to walk away, but their aggression against his wife had sealed their fate. He would uncover who they were, why they had come, and ensure they never threatened Claire, or anyone else in the neighborhood, again. Claire glanced back at him, her expression steady despite her lingering fear. "They thought they could scare me," she said quietly, "but all they did was make me angry." Jack met her eyes, his jaw firm. "Good, because we're going to need that strength." Above them, the first stars appeared in the night sky. The neighborhood seemed calm on the surface, but both Jack and Claire knew the storm was only beginning. Jack Dalton had always trusted his instincts, and tonight they were sharper than ever. As he walked into the living room and saw Claire sitting with her cheek still marked from the assault, a wave of cold focus swept over him. His heart ached at the sight of her injury, but his mind was already analyzing the situation. Every detail mattered, and he replayed Claire's account in his head like a mission briefing. Claire rested on the sofa, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had tried to reassure him earlier, insisting she would be fine, but Jack knew her better than that. She was strong, but the slap had been more than physical pain. It was a deliberate act of humiliation. That was what fueled his determination. "Tell me again," Jack said gently, kneeling beside her. "Everything you remember, their uniforms, their voices, the car, don't leave out a single detail." Claire nodded, taking a steady breath. "There were 3 of them. The one with the clipboard seemed to be in charge. He talked the most. His badge didn't look real. It was shiny but flat like a toy. The other 2 stood behind him, but they weren't just standing. They were watching me, studying, like they were waiting for something." Jack absorbed her words. "What about their vehicle?" "It was a black SUV," Claire replied. "Big, newer model, no markings, no plates on the front. The back windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside." Jack's jaw tightened. A black SUV, unmarked, tinted windows. That wasn't a coincidence. It was the type of vehicle used by groups who didn't want to be identified. Whoever they weren't amateurs. Claire's eyes searched his face. "Jack, they slapped me because I questioned them, but it didn't feel random. It was like they wanted to prove a point." "They did," Jack said calmly. "They wanted to test you to see how you'd react. That slap wasn't about punishment, it was about control." He stood, packing slowly across the room. His military background gave him an ability most people didn't have, the skill to read intent beneath the surface. To him, these imposters weren't acting like bored troublemakers or petty criminals. They were executing a plan, and that made them dangerous. Jack poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window at the street beyond. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, families inside their homes, porch lights glowing, shadows moving behind curtains. But he couldn't shake the image of the 3 men standing in his yard, exuding false authority. They had invaded his home's safety, and that was something Jack would never allow again. Claire broke the silence. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Yes," Jack said without hesitation. "They didn't get what they wanted tonight. They'll return. People like that don't just disappear." "And when they do?" she asked. Jack turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "Then I'll be ready for them." The following day, Jack began piecing together the imposters' patterns. He reviewed the neighborhood's layout, checking where cameras were mounted and which houses had good vantage points. He spoke to a few neighbors, though most were reluctant to admit what they had seen. Fear had silenced them, but their nervous glances told Jack enough. Others had noticed the SUV, and some had even seen the slap, but no one wanted to get involved. Jack didn't blame them. Civilians weren't trained for confrontation, but he was. By late afternoon, he sat at his desk with a notebook filled with observations. He wrote down their approximate height, build, and the way they carried themselves. Their uniforms had been too clean, too coordinated to be random. Their movements suggested discipline, maybe even training. Jack had dealt with groups like this before, teams who acted under orders, often for money. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Claire entered the room quietly. "You've been at this all day," she said softly. Jack closed the notebook. "I have to be. They crossed a line when they hurt you. I need to know who they are and why they came here." Claire sat beside him. "I trust you, I always have, but promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't let this turn into something bigger than it has to be. We came here for peace, Jack. I don't want to lose that." Jack reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise I'll protect our peace. But to do that, I need to face this head-on. If I ignore it, they'll only grow bolder." Claire looked into his eyes, and though fear lingered in her expression, she nodded. She knew her husband too well to argue. He wasn't a man who turned away from threats. He confronted them, dismantled them, and ensured they couldn't return. That night, as Claire drifted into an uneasy sleep, Jack remained awake, seated near the window with his thoughts racing. He wasn't just a retired SEAL enjoying suburban life anymore. He was a soldier again, preparing for a mission. The difference this time was personal. The mission wasn't for his country. It was for Claire. Jack whispered to himself, a vow that steadied his resolve. They think they scared us. They think they're in control, but they have no idea who they've picked a fight with. Outside, the quiet street stretched into darkness, but Jack knew it was only the calm before another storm. The morning sun brought little comfort. Jack woke early, his mind already racing with thoughts from the night before. While Claire tried to resume her normal routine, Jack's focus was fixed on the men who had invaded their peace. He had faced enemies on battlefields across the world, but now the threat was in his own neighborhood. That made it personal. Jack started his investigation with the basics. He walked the neighborhood, casual and unhurried, but his eyes scanned every detail. Years of training allowed him to notice things most people ignored: the direction of tire marks, the timing of streetlights, and the way residents moved about their yards. He wasn't just looking for clues, he was looking for patterns. At the far end of the street, he found a small security camera mounted on a neighbor's garage. The family who lived there, the Whitakers, were friendly but cautious. Jack approached them with an easy smile. "Morning," he said. "I was wondering if your camera might have picked up that black SUV from the other night." Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "We did see something, but Jack, we don't want trouble. Those men look dangerous." Jack nodded. "I understand. I'll handle the trouble. I just need the footage." After a moment, she relented and handed him a flash drive. "Please be careful." Back home, Jack plugged the drive into his laptop. The footage showed the SUV pulling up, the men stepping out, and the confrontation with Claire. The angle wasn't perfect, but it captured enough: their coordinated movements, the way they scanned the area, and how quickly they retreated when finished. What struck Jack most was their discipline. They didn't waste time. They had rehearsed this kind of intimidation. Jack paused the video and zoomed in on the SUV. No front plate, as Claire had said. But on the rear, just before they drove off, a small glare revealed something: the faint outline where a license plate should have been, as if it had been removed. Another sign of deliberate concealment. Later that afternoon, Jack visited another neighbor, a retired postal worker named Harris, who often sat on his porch. Harris had sharp eyes and a memory for details. "Did you notice anything about that SUV the other night?" Jack asked. Harris leaned back in his chair. "Sure did. They weren't locals. Those men moved like they owned the street. And their car, too new, too polished, not a scratch on it. That tells me it wasn't their everyday ride. They brought it here for a reason." Jack thanked him, his suspicions deepening. The imposters weren't simple criminals. They were organized, possibly hired for a specific purpose. And their choice to disguise themselves as Homeowners Association security meant they wanted a cover that wouldn't raise suspicion. That pointed to planning, not impulse. By evening, Jack's notebook was filled with observations. He noted their body language: straight backs, minimal gestures, constant scanning. They didn't slouch like careless thugs. They carried themselves like men trained to follow orders. Jack had seen that posture before in both allies and enemies. Claire walked into the room carrying 2 mugs of tea. She set one beside him. "You've been at this all day," she said softly. "Any progress?" Jack closed the notebook and looked at her. "Yes, they weren't acting alone. This wasn't random. Someone sent them here." Claire's eyes widened slightly. "Sent them? Why? What could they possibly want from us?" Jack shook his head. "Not us specifically. At least not yet. They're running some kind of operation. Maybe intimidation, maybe extortion. Whatever it is, they picked the wrong house to test it on." Claire sipped her tea, her hands steady now compared to the night before. "So what's the next step?" "I set the terms," Jack replied firmly. "If they come back, it won't be on their schedule. It'll be on mine." That night, while Claire slept, Jack prepared. He checked the locks, adjusted the outdoor lighting, and set up discreet cameras around the property. He also placed a small tracker device near the driveway, disguised as a piece of garden equipment. If the SUV returned, he would know. As he moved through the shadows of his own yard, Jack felt the familiar rhythm of readiness return. It was the same calm focus he had felt before missions. His neighbors saw him as a retired veteran settling into suburban life, but tonight he was something else entirely. He was a hunter, waiting for the prey to reveal itself. Standing on the porch, Jack scanned the dark street one last time before heading inside. Somewhere out there, the imposters were planning their next move. Jack knew they believed they held the upper hand, but they didn't know who he was. They didn't know they had stepped into the home of a man trained to dismantle threats from the inside out. Jack whispered to himself, his voice steady. "You'll be back, and when you are, I'll be waiting." Jack Dalton never acted on impulse. His military career had taught him that preparation was the difference between survival and disaster. Now, sitting at his kitchen table with a notebook of observations, he sketched the beginnings of a plan. The imposters had tested his wife and struck her to establish dominance. That meant they expected fear. Instead, Jack would give them confidence, a trap hidden behind the illusion of weakness. Claire watched him from across the table, her arms folded. "You're planning something," she said softly. Jack met her eyes. "I'm not letting them control when or how they strike again. If they're going to come back, it'll be because I want them to." Claire frowned, though there was no hesitation in her voice. "And you're setting bait." "Yes," Jack said. "Something obvious enough to draw their attention but not suspicious. They're expecting resistance, so I'll give them what looks like a mistake. They'll come back to correct it." The following day, Jack began his work. He intentionally arranged several violations that would stand out to anyone pretending to be homeowners association enforcement. He moved Claire's flower pots back into their original spots, placed a ladder against the side of the house as if left there carelessly, and even left a garden hose stretched across the lawn. To the imposters, it would look like carelessness, a homeowner breaking rules without regard for authority. Claire stood beside him as he worked. "It feels strange, leaving things messy on purpose." Jack gave a small smile. "It won't be for long, trust me." Inside the house, Jack installed hidden cameras at multiple angles. Small devices no larger than coins were placed under the porch railing, near the garage light, and inside the mailbox. Each one fed directly to his laptop, giving him real-time visuals of their yard. He also placed motion sensors in the driveway, set to alert him the moment a vehicle approached. Claire walked through the living room, noticing how methodical he had become. "You're treating this like a mission," she said. Jack paused, looking at her. "That's exactly what it is. The difference is this mission is to protect you, and I won't fail." Her expression softened, and though fear still lingered, it was tempered by trust. She had lived through Jack's deployments, waiting for letters and phone calls, always praying for his safe return. Now the battlefield had shifted, but she knew he was still the man who always came back to her. As night approached, Jack reviewed his setup one last time. He sat by the window with his laptop open, cameras streaming quietly. The house appeared dark from the outside, giving the illusion that its occupants were asleep. Claire sat nearby with a book in her lap, though she turned more pages than she read. Both of them waited, the silence stretching into the night. Hours passed. A breeze rustled the trees, and the streetlights cast pools of yellow on the empty road. Then, just after midnight, Jack's motion sensor gave a faint vibration. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as a black SUV rolled slowly into view. "They're here," Jack said quietly. Claire set her book down, her hands tightening around the arm of her chair. The SUV stopped at the edge of their driveway. 3 men stepped out just as before. Their movements were careful, calculated, as though they expected resistance but didn't fear it. The man with the clipboard led the way, his posture smug. From his vantage point inside, Jack watched them approach the flower pots again. The leader gestured, and one of the others moved to kick the pots aside, scattering soil across the steps. Another walked toward the ladder, shaking his head in mock disapproval. Jack's pulse slowed instead of quickening. This was the moment he had prepared for. Every camera was rolling, every angle documented. More importantly, every movement of the imposters was now on his terms. Claire whispered, "What do we do now?" Jack's gaze never left the laptop screen. "Now we let them think they're winning." He rose quietly, moving to the back of the house where he had prepared his approach. Stepping into the night, he blended into the shadows, circling around until he came up behind their SUV. With practiced precision, he reached underneath and disabled the vehicle's ignition system with a small tool from his pocket. By the time he slipped back into position, the imposters had no idea their escape route was already gone. Inside the house, Claire watched from the window, her breath caught in her throat. The imposters believed they were in control, unaware that every step they took tightened the noose Jack had laid for them. When the leader raised his hand to knock on the front door, Jack whispered to himself, his voice calm and certain. "You came back exactly as planned." The sharp rap on the front door echoed through the quiet house. Claire sat rigid on the couch, her pulse hammering in her ears. She stared at the door, afraid the imposters could somehow see through it and know she was inside. Jack crouched near the back hallway, his body pressed close to the wall. He had positioned himself with a clear view of the living room and the entryway. The imposters thought they were in control, but every move they made was already part of his design. Another knock followed, this one louder, followed by a voice. "Open up. HOA enforcement. You're violating multiple community rules. We need to speak with you now." Claire clenched her fists, remembering the last time they came, how the leader had raised his hand and struck her without hesitation. But now something was different. She wasn't alone. Jack was here, and the imposters had no idea what kind of man they were about to confront. Jack signaled to her silently from the shadows, pressing one finger to his lips. She gave a slight nod, understanding she should stay quiet. Outside, the leader turned to his men. "If they don't answer, we'll handle it. People like this need to be shown who's in charge." The taller of the two men muttered, "This feels risky. What if someone calls the real police?" The leader scoffed. "They won't. People don't want trouble. Trust me, I've been doing this long enough." At that moment, Jack stepped silently onto the porch from the side entrance. His movements were fluid, deliberate, his presence like a shadow slipping into place. None of the imposters had noticed him yet. From his position, he could see all three men clearly, two near the flower pots and one standing squarely in front of the door. "You've been doing this long enough," Jack said evenly, his voice carrying with quiet authority, "but tonight it ends." All three men spun around in shock. The leader recovered first, narrowing his eyes as he stepped forward. "And who are you supposed to be? Another homeowner scared of a fine." Jack didn't flinch. "I'm the husband of the woman you assaulted, and you made the mistake of coming back." The leader laughed, though there was an edge to it now. "What, you think you can scare us? We run this neighborhood." Jack's tone stayed calm, but his words cut sharp. "No, you prey on it. There's a difference." The imposter closest to the ladder shifted uneasily, his confidence cracking. "Boss, maybe we should go." Jack stepped closer, the porch light catching the sharpness of his gaze. "You can't go anywhere. Your vehicle won't start. I made sure of that." The three men stiffened, realizing too late that their escape route was gone. The leader's bravado faltered for the first time, though he quickly tried to mask it with anger. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack tilted his head slightly. "Neither do you." In one swift motion, the leader tried to shove Jack aside, but Jack caught his wrist midair and twisted it effortlessly, sending the man stumbling to his knees. The other two lunged forward, but Jack's training took over. He sidestepped the first, driving an elbow into his ribs with surgical precision, then swept the other's legs out from under him with a single strike. Within seconds, all three were on the ground, groaning in pain, their arrogance shattered. Jack stood above them, composed and unshaken, as if he had anticipated every move they would make. Claire opened the front door cautiously, her eyes wide. "Jack," she whispered, both relieved and astonished. He glanced at her briefly, his expression softening just enough to reassure her. "It's all right. They're not going to hurt you again." The leader struggled to sit up, clutching his wrist. "You can't just do this. You'll regret it." Jack crouched down so that his eyes met the man's. "The only thing I regret is not being here the first time you came, but I promise you this, You're done terrorizing families in this neighborhood." From his pocket, Jack pulled out a small recording device. He pressed play, and the imposters' voices from earlier filled the night air. Threats, arrogance, and their own admission of pretending to enforce rules. Jack had captured every word. The leader's face paled. "You're not walking away tonight," Jack said firmly. "You're walking into custody." As if on cue, distant sirens began to wail. Jack had sent Claire to quietly alert the real authorities earlier, knowing this confrontation would come to a head. Now, with evidence in hand and the imposters subdued, the trap was complete. The three men looked at each other in panic, their bravado stripped away. The leader muttered something under his breath, but Jack stood tall, unmoved. For the first time since the ordeal began, Claire felt the weight lifting from her chest. Her husband hadn't just protected her. He had dismantled the threat at its root. The sirens grew louder, red and blue lights flickering against the houses on the street. Jack glanced once more at the men on the ground. Game over. The wail of sirens grew louder until the flashing red and blue lights washed across the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors peered from their windows, curtains shifting as the sound of approaching patrol cars broke the stillness of midnight. Some even stepped onto their porches, curiosity overcoming caution. Jack stood calmly on the porch, his frame straight and steady as the three imposters sat restrained on the ground. He had tied their wrists with nylon cord he kept in his emergency kit, his knots precise and unyielding. Claire stood just inside the doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. Two police cars pulled to a stop in front of the house. Officers stepped out quickly, hands on their holsters as they surveyed the scene. The leader of the imposters shouted, his voice breaking with a mix of anger and desperation. "Officer, arrest him! He attacked us for no reason." Jack said nothing at first. He allowed the officers to approach, his composure unshaken, before he slowly raised his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "I think you'll want to hear the whole story before you make any judgments." The senior officer, a broad-shouldered man with a sharp gaze, stepped forward. "Start talking." Jack pulled the small recorder from his pocket. "These men have been posing as association enforcers, extorting families in this neighborhood. They came to my home twice, once to assault my wife, and tonight to intimidate us further. Everything they said tonight is on this recording." He pressed play, and the imposters' voices spilled into the night. Their threats, their mocking comments, and the leader's own words about running the neighborhood rang out clearly. Several neighbors gathered closer, listening with shock as the truth unfolded. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. "They came last week when my husband wasn't home. They struck me when I refused to give them money. I was too afraid to tell anyone until now." The officer's jaw tightened. He turned to the three men on the ground. "Is this true?" The imposters didn't answer. Their silence was as damning as the recording. Jack added, "Their SUV is parked right there. You'll find fake paperwork in it. Clipboards, forms, even a badge they used to trick residents. I disabled the engine so they couldn't flee." Another officer quickly moved to the vehicle and began searching. Within moments he called out, "He's right. Boxes of forms, fake violation notices, and a briefcase full of cash." The crowd of neighbors murmured, voices rising in disbelief and anger. For months, many of them had complained quietly about strange visits, unexpected fines, and unexplained demands for money. Now the truth was laid bare before them. The leader of the imposters snarled, struggling against the cord. "You think you're a hero? You don't know who we work for. This won't stop here." Jack crouched, his gaze steady but firm. "The difference between you and me is that I don't bluff. You'll spend tonight in a cell, and tomorrow your little scheme falls apart." The officers pulled the imposters to their feet and began leading them toward the patrol cars. The leader shouted empty threats, but they rang hollow in the face of flashing lights and recorded evidence. As the men were loaded into the vehicles, a woman from across the street called out, her voice filled with relief. "He's telling the truth. I've seen them at my house too. They tried to find me for repainting my fence. I knew something was wrong." Another neighbor added, They came to me last month, said I owed hundreds for parking violations. I almost paid them. The senior officer raised his voice, addressing the small crowd that had gathered. Anyone who has been approached by these men should file a report. With this evidence, we can charge them not just for fraud and assault, but for a pattern of intimidation across the entire community. Claire stepped closer to Jack, her hand slipping into his. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. The officer turned back to Jack. You handled this better than most would, but next time let us handle it sooner. You put yourself at risk. Jack gave a small nod. I've spent my life managing risk, but I won't apologize for protecting my wife. The officer studied him for a moment, then gave a brief, respectful nod in return. Understood. As the patrol cars pulled away with the imposters inside, the neighborhood seemed to exhale collectively. Conversations broke out, neighbors thanking Jack and Claire, others expressing shock at how long the deception had gone on. Jack didn't bask in the gratitude. He simply squeezed Claire's hand and guided her back inside. The danger wasn't fully gone, not until he knew why these men had chosen their neighborhood in the first place. But for now, the immediate threat had been dismantled, and that was enough. Claire glanced up at him as they closed the door. It feels like a storm has passed. Jack's eyes lingered on the distant patrol lights fading down the street. Storms don't just pass. Sometimes they hide, waiting to come back stronger, and I intend to be ready. Morning sunlight streamed across the neighborhood, casting a calm glow over the rows of tidy houses. For the first time in weeks, the Dalton home felt quiet, not tense, not watchful, but calm. Claire stood by the kitchen window with a cup of tea in her hand, gazing at the flower pots Jack had carefully set back in place. They no longer looked like bait. They looked like a home again. Jack entered the room, his phone still in his hand. The police confirmed it, he said, setting the phone on the counter. Those men weren't acting alone. They were part of a small group running scams across several towns, but thanks to the evidence we gave them, they'll be facing charges in court. Fraud, assault, impersonating officials. It adds up. Claire exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and weariness. So it's really over. Jack nodded, though his expression stayed thoughtful. For us, yes, but there will always be people like them trying to use fear to control others. The important thing is the community won't fall for it again. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood gathered in the small park at the center of the subdivision. Word had spread quickly about the imposters and their arrest. Families came with folding chairs, children played on the grass, and conversations buzzed with gratitude and concern. For the first time, it felt like the neighbors weren't just sharing a space. They were sharing an experience that bound them together. The senior police officer who had led the arrest stood at the front, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. Thanks to evidence provided by Mr. Dalton and testimony from several of you, the suspects will be prosecuted to the fullest extent. We encourage anyone approached by them to file an official statement. Your cooperation ensures justice. Applause broke out, but many turned their eyes toward Jack. He stood with Claire at the edge of the group, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. One of the older residents, Mrs. Reeves, approached him directly. You did more than protect your wife, young man. You protected all of us. Those men had been bleeding this neighborhood dry for months. Jack shook his head slightly. I just did what had to be done. Another neighbor, a father of two, added, sometimes that's what makes the difference, doing what others are too afraid to do. Claire watched her husband with quiet pride. She knew he didn't seek recognition. His actions came from instinct, discipline, and love. But seeing the neighborhood look to him with respect filled her with a sense of reassurance. In the days that followed, the community began to heal. The official homeowners association, which had been largely absent during the imposter scheme, stepped up to repair its reputation. They scheduled open meetings, revised their communication system, and made sure residents had direct lines to legitimate board members. Transparency replaced fear, and the neighbors began to trust each other again. Claire threw herself into helping organize the first official community event since the incident, a weekend gathering in the park with food, games, and music. Jack was hesitant at first, preferring quiet evenings at home, but Claire persuaded him. It's not about us anymore. It's about showing everyone we're stronger than before. On the day of the event, laughter filled the park as children ran with balloons and adults mingled around tables of homemade dishes. Jack stood off to the side, scanning the area with the same quiet vigilance that never left him. Claire slipped her arm through his, smiling up at him. "You can relax," she teased gently. "Not every crowd is a mission." Jack chuckled softly, the sound rare but warm. "Old habits," he admitted. Mrs. Reeves raised a glass of lemonade during a short speech. "To the Daltons," she said proudly, "for reminding us that courage isn't just for battlefields, it belongs in our own backyards too." The crowd cheered, though Jack lifted his hand in protest. "It wasn't just us," he said firmly. "It was everyone who spoke up, everyone who refused to be silent. That's what makes a neighborhood strong." Claire leaned closer, whispering just for him. "Still, they needed someone to start it, and that was you." As the sun set and lanterns lit the park, Jack finally allowed himself a moment of peace. He knew challenges would always come. Life had taught him that. But standing beside Claire, surrounded by neighbors who now looked out for each other instead of looking away, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Home wasn't just a place. It was the people you protected, the bonds you built, and the trust you earned. Jack glanced at Claire, her smile soft in the glow of the lanterns, and felt the weight lift completely. The imposters had underestimated him, thinking they could bully his family into silence. They hadn't known they were stepping into the path of a man who had faced far greater battles and never once backed down. The neighborhood was safe again. His wife was safe again, and for Jack Dalton that was victory enough. "You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew."